gentlemen, and joining me for the second segment of tonight's program is Ambassador Mohamed Salem, member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. Always a pleasure having you with us.
Good evening, how are you?
Let me start off by asking you, obviously, how you view the recent developments with regards to Syria, especially when we're looking at the US-Russian tensions that we've recently seen.
The conflict in northern Syria is really a microcosm of the Syrian conflict, the Syrian civil war.
Right.
It has several levels of complexity. It has a local level. There's a competition between many local actors. It has a regional dimension with a polarization between two groups of regional countries who are backing various factions. And then it has an international level, most prominently seen from the perspective of the American-Russian competition, but it does include other parties as well. So you have European parties involved, you have China also involved at a certain level in coordination with Russia. So this complexity means that what we see in every little move, every little attempt to change the balance of power on the ground involves repercussions for all of the other levels.
Right.
And there are adjustments in this process. I would say the most interesting things in terms of the American-Russian relationship is the capacity of both parties to cooperate on steering the conflict towards a political solution. That both parties do not see major stakes in this for them, although the Russians see some linkage between developments in Syria and the possible threat of what is called the Islamic republics inside Russia, of receiving the virus of Islamic extremism.
Right.
So there is a Russian interest in that, which is much more perhaps related to Russian national security, much more than perhaps the American position. So these two parties are, despite their conflicts, are attempting to cooperate, and the question is this cooperation sufficient to enforce a settlement on all of the other levels, the regional level and the local level? I think what we're seeing now is the fact that it's much more difficult to implement the settlements that, or the cadre, or the framework that has been agreed so far between mainly Russia and the United States. It's more difficult to implement this on the ground.
Right. Recently, the two have been trading accusations about Russia hitting all the opposition and not particularly the Daesh or certain radicals. How does the United States expect Russia to be able to differentiate between the opposition supporting the coalition and Daesh and so on and so forth when it's striking from the air?
I would suggest to you that the level of information that is available to most of the parties is much more than what we read in the newspapers.
Right.
So between the monitoring processes that are in place, between the different committees that, incidentally, both the Americans and the Russians are sitting on a number of committees together without anybody else, including military committees. So there is a certain amount of military information that is being passed between both parties. What you're looking at is not a failure, a technical failure. It's much more of a political failure. In Resolution 2254, it's clear that the Security Council resolution on Syria, which represents the framework for political work, it's clear that both Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra are outside the framework of the ceasefire.
Right.
The Russians have argued that they are supporting the regime in Syria in its strikes against these two parties. In reality, mainly the Western reports on Russian actions are saying that the Russians are targeting a much wider group of opposition parties. Now, together with the Russians, let's remember that there are other parties supporting the regime. Iran, Hezbollah, Shia parties from Iraq, and from Afghanistan. So it's much more complicated.
Right.
And on the Daesh front, we're seeing a large number of foreign fighters that have nothing to do with Syria. So it's a much more complex issue as to the technicalities of whether one strike has targeted which opposition group. Now, America has come up with the idea of establishing a Syrian Democratic Army in a way to get away from the support to Islamic factions. This is built mainly around the Kurds,
Right.
with implications for relations with Turkey, but also for the kind of Syria that will emerge if a political settlement succeeds, because the Kurds in the end will opt for, if not a degree of local administration or self-rule, they would opt for independence. So this is the complexity.
And that would also affect Iraq, wouldn't it?
That would immediately affect Turkey, Iran, and Iraq.
Right. Now, with the Syrian Democratic Forces, they're mainly Kurds fighting in this war. Where does Russia stand when it comes to the SDF?
Russia has been very supportive of the Kurds on a number of issues, for a number of reasons.
Right.
One of them is the fact that the Kurds come across as a much more secular formula. They have been effective in their military actions. There is also a little bit of a conflict between Russia and Turkey. So it realizes that this is a way to punish Turkey on its taking down a Russian fighter earlier this year. So the Russians are looking at this again, and I must say that in analyzing this, it's very interesting to see how the Kurdish movement has to obtain support from a very different set of allies. It has managed to obtain support from the United States and Russia at the same time. It has managed to obtain support from some countries in Western Europe, including the French, for example, who have now admitted that they have military advisors with the Kurds. So these dynamics, it has obtained support from Iran in the past. So these dynamics are telling us that this is a conflict that can continue for a long period of time, and this is a scenario that we need to really keep in mind all the time, that the peace process may not lead to results in the end, may fail, and then we have a conflict that carries on for at least another 5 years or so.
Right.
It is a conflict that can generate very unwelcome results. We may see a Kurdish entity, we may see a Kurdish entity also coming in Iraq because of the close interaction between those two dynamics. We may see a huge surge in the amount of human suffering.
Right, but if you look at it from a conspiracy theorist perspective, you would find that it indirectly again serves this division of the Middle East into small statelets.
The idea of a conspiracy is that there is an outside force that has control.
Right.
What we see is outside sources, powers do not have control. What you see is that the state structure in many Arab countries is disintegrating and collapsing, and new identities and new entities are taking over.
Right.
And because of this dynamic, the simplistic explanation is to say, oh, there's an international conspiracy. But really, you're seeing that there are a new set of forces that are in play, and you're seeing some other powers and institutions who are not playing their role. The Arab countries of the region do not have a vision or a plan to deal with this. The regional organization, the Arab League, has been unable to cope with it. It's just beyond its capacities, and it's beyond the way it's designed. So you really need to go back to the blackboard and reinvent all of these things and say, is this the regional organization is capable of dealing with these kind of problems. It's designed for a different age and time. How can we change it? You have to look also at the way Arab countries are working together now. I mean, is there a need for a more robust reaction to something like Daesh? I would ask, for example, where is the Arab military response to Daesh? Why is it that the Arab world are relying entirely on the United States to deal with Daesh? And why is it that Arab public opinion is unaware that there is no Arab dimension to this?
Right.
Why is it that we don't have a capacity to conduct any observer force role to observe ceasefires? Why is it that we don't have any peacekeeping force? Why are all of these gaps there?
Right. If we go back to Syria, now recently we've heard President Vladimir Putin suggest that the Syrian opposition could join the current government to create a new, if you will, a new power entity. Why was this initiative shot down by the United States?
Incidentally, by the way, it wasn't accepted by the Syrian government either.
Right.
So you have to see that in many, you will notice that even inside the Russian-Syrian relationship, there is some lack of coordination. So you can track this back to many incidents over the last few months that tell us that there isn't 100% overlapping between Damascus and Moscow. The Geneva process sets out some mechanisms. They're not very far from this one. It's just that there is a mechanism that is required by the Geneva process and by Security Council Resolution 2254 to establish a new government, shall we say, just to get away from the terminology, because the terminology is very sensitive on this. Now the idea is that basically there would be a ceasefire, that there would be humanitarian action to assist populations that are in need of assistance, and there is a need for a political process that includes the design of a new constitution and a government that will take over in a transitory process leading to elections and a new situation. Now, the debate now is because of the deadlines are coming up now for this process should be agreed by the beginning of August. So we're running out of time. The Geneva process has stalled. The conflict on the ground has to some extent re-emerged. It's not, the ceasefire has not entirely collapsed, but it has huge holes in it. And in this, there is a fear that the whole political process may collapse completely. Right. Now, the discussion was, what would be the role of the current President Bashar al-Assad, in the process? There seems to be an international consensus that at a certain moment in the process, there will be the emergence of a new regime in Syria. Now, the question is, should President Bashar withdraw at the beginning of the process, or in the middle of the process, or at the end of it? We're talking about the transitional phase. Right. We're not talking about the full process of solving the problems of Syria. And of course, you can see that certain parties, like Saudi Arabia, the United States, other parties, are insisting on an early departure for President Assad. You will see other parties, like the Russians, saying there is a fear of a total collapse in Syria. We will have a huge mess if the current regime collapses all of a sudden.
Well, so don't you favor that Russian position? Because we've seen examples where you've taken away the dictator, quote unquote, and chaos.
Yeah, but it's not for us to favor one solution or the other. This is something for the Syrian people to decide.
But then people,
and you have a Syrian
you've got
process.
The argument that how can the Syrian people under siege, you know, scattered across the globe, how can they make that decision?
No, but the UN, the international system has accepted the role for Syrian opposition in international negotiations. And the Syrian opposition has a certain position.
Do you believe that the Syrian opposition represents the Syrian people?
In as much that they represent a certain current in Syrian society that requires change.
Right.
And I think there is a global consensus that change is needed, not only in Syria, in many other countries in the region.
Right. How important is peace, though, and that a peaceful solution or that a political solution is found in order for the Syrian conflict to be resolved, or at least to start seeing some resolution to the conflict?
Everybody agrees that a political solution is needed, but we need to look at the political solution in a realistic manner.
Right.
Political solutions are a result of balances of, they are a result of military positions on the ground. They're a result also of the capacity of each party in the conflict to sustain a long-term conflict. If they get exhausted, then that helps sometimes to bring a political solution nearer. If they have more resources and they are stubborn with their insistence on maintaining or achieving their maximalistic objectives, then that makes it more difficult. But there is an agreement, at least publicly, on the fact that a political solution is needed. But what are the terms of the solution? Does it include the process of change or not? Which parties? We know that even the parties within the opposition, there are huge amounts of differences between them. One of the failures of the opposition is it hasn't really managed to join hands sufficiently and come with a convincing platform and a political elite that can convincingly take over power in the future.
Right. Recently, though, since we're talking about peace, more than 50 U.S. State Department officials have signed an internal memo urging the United States to carry out military strikes against the Assad regime. How do you view that, and is it a flagrant hostility against Syria or the Syrian government?
There has always been an opinion, whether in the United States, in the West, or in some Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, that a more robust Western position and willingness to conduct military operations against the Syrian regime would have helped the process of achieving a political settlement. There is another group of people who've said all along that more military involvement by outside powers only increases the complexity and also the level of suffering. If we look at this from the perspective of the U.S. administration, you have an administration that its central policy is not to be involved militarily. It doesn't want to expand its military role. It doesn't want to get involved in long-term conflicts. It sees that, whether rightly or wrongly, but that's their perspective, it sees that one of the problems with American power is that it got involved in many small wars around the world that take away from American prestige and American attention, require a huge amount of time and effort, and do not allow the U.S. to look at the huge strategic forces that are shaping the 21st century. The ascendancy of Asia, the role of China in the South China Sea, and so on. So it wants really to change perspective. This group of diplomats is probably expressing a frustration at the fact that the Syrian conflict is not going anywhere at the moment.
Right.
And perhaps an over-optimism that a military operation can be conducted in a surgical way that doesn't involve any confrontation with the Russians, for example, or does not solicit a higher level from parties like Iran and Hezbollah and so on.
All right. I thank you very much, Ambassador Mohamed Salem, member of the Egyptian Council for Foreign Affairs. It was a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Daily Debate. Do join us again tomorrow, though, same time, same place. We're on Nile TV International. I'm Nancy Sarah Barakat, wishing you all a very good evening.